you everyone for coming. This is another Dr. Miriam and Children Adelson seminar for the Endowment for Middle East Truth, EMET. Today we have a great seminar with Michael Rubin. He is a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. He's a former Pentagon official whose major research areas are the Middle East, Turkey, Iran, and diplomacy. He also instructs senior military officers deploying to the Middle East and Afghanistan, and he's done so on an aircraft carrier, which is very interesting. He's lived in the post-revolution Iran, in Yemen, both pre- and post-Iraq, and he's also spent some time with the Taliban before 9/11. His newest book is Dancing with the Devil, The Perils of Engaging Rogue Regimes.
Thank you very much. Again, I'm a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. I want to thank EMET for having me here today. One of the worst things about working at a think tank in Washington, D.C. is whenever you're under deadline for a book chapter, an op-ed, a translation, whatever, invariably that's when you get the call and you have to do the talking head bit on TV. I was once doing this on one of the cable networks, and I came back after doing my 17 seconds of wisdom about Iran, and in the green room was a governor from a southwestern state, and he had a whole entourage with him. And one of his aides said, "You know, you look good up there." And I said, "That's kind of funny, because my wife had just texted me and said, 'Michael, I thought you looked fat, bald, and mean.'" And the governor looked up from his notes and said, "Nah, I didn't think you looked mean." The point of this is, no matter how mean I may or may not look, feel free to ask questions at any time. As a former Pentagon official, one of the biggest takeaways I got from working in the Office of Secretary of Defense during the Bush administration was that PowerPoint is the work of Satan. So I'm not coming up here with a whole PowerPoint presentation or anything like that, and I'll be happy to stop and answer a question, although we'll also have time for questions at the end. What I'm talking about today is the whole issue with regard to lessons from diplomacy, lessons from the Middle East peace process, because one of the things that shocked me, as someone who grew up in Northeast Philadelphia, who went to a Quaker school for 14 years, and then ended up in university for 9 more years, so it really grew up in the bubble, I never served in the military, was that when I first started working with the military, doing training for the Army, the Marines, the Navy, was just how much time people in the military spend going over their mistakes, whether that's in terms of a sergeant chewing out a soldier. I mean, it's not just to insult them, it's not just to break them down, it's to make them a better soldier. Same thing with chiefs and sailors and so forth. Likewise, the amount of time spent on after-action reports, whether it's in an exercise or whether it's out in Iraq or Afghanistan or Syria or Libya after an engagement. The whole point is, what did we do wrong? How can we do it better? What I was shocked by was that never in the last 60+ years of high-profile State Department diplomacy with rogue regimes or terror groups has the State Department ever conducted a lessons learned exercise. They've never looked at, for example, the peace process with the Palestinians or diplomacy with Saddam Hussein pre-2003 or diplomacy with the Taliban, let alone Iran and North Korea. And they've never looked at it and said, okay, we started out with this goal. We only ended up here. What were the inflection points in our diplomacy that would have enabled us to have a more successful outcome? And it's often attributed to Albert Einstein, I mean falsely, honestly, but the whole notion of insanity being trying the same action repeatedly but getting a different result each time. And this has become really the basis of our diplomacy, whether it's regard to Middle East peace or whether it's with regard to Iran, North Korea, or elsewhere. Let me just give you an example. A lot of people believe that after 2001, we rediscovered Afghanistan after having ignored it when the Soviet Union left in 1989. The fact of the matter is that that's simply not true. We had, especially during the Clinton administration, between 1995 and the year 2000, high-level diplomacy with the Taliban, including cabinet-level meetings, on more than 30 different occasions, according to George Washington University's National Security Archives. And we had 2 main goals from that diplomacy when you look at the declassified documents. One was to close the terror training camps, and the second was to turn over or at least quarantine Osama bin Laden. Well, the Taliban had repeatedly said that these had been achieved. And yet, of course, on 9/11, that was proven to be false. Well, during the last administration, we again began negotiating with the Taliban. When Hillary Clinton became Secretary of State, she basically said, well, if you're not going to talk to your enemies, then who are you going to talk to? As in the context of re-engaging with the Taliban. I mean, peace is made by talking to your enemies, not by simply bombing them. We ended up talking to some of the same Taliban officials with whom we had been talking to between 1995 and the year 2000. But because the State Department generally, or the US government more broadly, doesn't have a great deal of institutional memory, especially upon the transition between administrations and so forth, we ended up negotiating not only with the Taliban, but with some of the exact same people with whom we had been negotiating 10 or 15 years before, who had either lied to us, or if they were sincere, they were powerless to act upon their agreements. And no one, seemingly in the administration, asked the question, the basic question, how do we know these guys are more sincere now than they were a decade ago? Another example with regard to this. In March of 2003, before Operation Iraqi Freedom, before the war in Iraq, the invasion of Iraq, the Bush administration negotiated with the Iranians at the same time that the British were negotiating with the Iranians. And this is literally a week or two before the war began. And the goal of the negotiations, I guess it was the British Foreign Secretary Robin Cook meeting with the Iranian Foreign Minister Kamal Farazi, and two US officials, Ryan Crocker, who was a State Department official at the time, Zalmay Khalilzad, who was a White House National Security Council official at the time, both of whom would subsequently become ambassadors to Iraq. They met with Iran's UN ambassador, a guy named Mohammad Javad Zarif. Mohammad Javad Zarif, of course, is now Iran's foreign minister and was the main interlocutor with regard to the Iranian nuclear negotiations. Well, when it came to the negotiations with Mohammad Javad Zarif, we reached an agreement. The Bush administration reached an agreement. And the agreement was that if any American aircraft accidentally overfly Iran, Iran's not going to try to shoot them down. In addition, if any American pilots are forced to land in Iran, Iran isn't going to molest American pilots. They're going to guarantee their safety and the safety of the American equipment. And the last thing was that Iran wouldn't interfere in Iraq directly. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps would not enter the country, nor would Iranian-sponsored militias. Well, we know, of course, that after Operation Iraqi Freedom began, whatever one thinks of that decision, the Iranians pushed in. And we know this not just from declassified American intelligence or the accusations of talking heads and so forth. We know this from Iran's own press. Some of them actually said, how can you expect the Americans to negotiate with us when you've, in effect, reached an agreement and then sent in 2,000 Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps men in contravention of that agreement? Now, there's two possibilities here with regard to Mohammad Javad Zarif, who's now Iran's foreign minister. Either he was lying to the Americans and knew that his word was absolutely no good, or he was perfectly sincere and believed that he was reaching an agreement. But at that time, he didn't have the power to implement the agreement because the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps in Iran is functionally separate from the Iranian presidency and the Iranian foreign ministry. Either way, it raises a real question about re-engaging the exact same man on an issue of such importance as the Iranian nuclear program if he doesn't have the power to enforce the Iranian side of the bargain. So ultimately, this is one of the big problems. More broadly, I grew up, again, in Northeast Philadelphia in a pretty liberal family, going to Quaker school, and you can't get more liberal than that, going to an Ivy League college, and so it's safe to say I grew up in a bubble. Spent about a quarter century in a bubble. if not more. And one of the things that was really drilled into us, and frankly, the same thing is true in the government today, in the military today, is this whole notion of multiculturalism. And every month is in a different appreciation month and so forth. But the way that multiculturalism is taught, it's all about appreciating each other's differences. In effect, it's about walking into a sushi restaurant and being able to order a mojito. But fundamentally, it completely misunderstands what multiculturalism is about. In fact, the way we approach it is culturally arrogant because we assume that everyone thinks just like us. We project our own value system onto people, and this, in a nutshell, also undercuts the effectiveness of US diplomacy. So, for example, why do we assume that when our diplomacy is about how to get to yes, how to come to a win-win compromise, that other countries that are, or groups or peoples whose cultural anchors are very, very different are on the same page as us? So, for example, the professor emeritus of Middle Eastern history, Bernard Lewis, and Islamic history, who I guess last May celebrated his 100th birthday, once had a very astute observation that when you look at the map of the Middle East, any country with straight lines on its borders is effectively an artificial country. But you look at a country like Iran. Iran isn't a straight line country. Iran has a history, a near contiguous history, that goes back more than 2,000 years. And when I was in grad school doing the doctorate in Iranian history, and again, growing up in Northeast Philly, my whole family were veterinarians, but I'm allergic to dogs and cats, so I was the black sheep of the family. The Iranian studies crowd, used to go out for drinks, get beers on Friday evenings, and see how far back we could name the leaders of Iran. Ali Khamenei, Ruhollah Khomeini, Mohammad Reza Shah, Ahmed Shah, Muhammad Ali Shah, Muzaffar al-Din Shah, Nasruddin. Believe it or not, none of us got married till we were in our 30s. But the point of this is Iran has this near contiguous history, and while we could look at the development of Western strategy, we could look at Machiavelli, we could look at Clausewitz, we could look at Hugo Grotius, and other philosophers that have helped shape our military and diplomatic thinking. Why is it we assume that the Iranians, or for that matter, the Chinese and the North Koreans, are utilizing have the same understanding of diplomacy? So, for example, the Iranians might look back to someone like Nizam al-Mulk, who was an 11th century, 12th century Grand Vizier, I believe, from the Seljuk dynasty, who wrote a book called the Siyasat-Nameh, which means basically the Handbook of Governance. And it was the equivalent of Machiavelli's Handbook for Princes. The point of this is, when you have this different evolution, we need to recognize that while we might look at diplomacy as coming to a win-win situation, others may look at diplomacy as a zero-sum game, or an asymmetric warfare strategy to tie the hands of adversaries while they advance their own goals. This is certainly true, for example, of Vladimir Putin in Russia. We've got a situation with Hassan Rouhani. When he stepped down from being the Supreme National Security Council chairman in Iran in 2005, after having been in that position for 17 years, he gave a speech at Ferdowsi University in Mashhad, the second largest city in Iran, basically defending his strategy, defending his legacy, because after all, this was the man who first started nuclear negotiations with the West. It's also the man who oversaw the secret nuclear program. At any rate, what he basically said is, don't criticize me, because at every opportunity, what I did is I lulled the Americans, specifically the Americans, into complacency with dialogue. And when they were complacent, then we delivered our knockout blow. He basically argued that his doctrine of surprise was a way of utilizing diplomacy in order to advance Iran's interests and defeat the United States. That doesn't seem like win-win diplomacy in the way that perhaps many in the State Department understand it. So we have to stop projecting our own, not only our own value system, but our own intellectual foundations onto our adversaries, and look at their positions and the development of their strategy on their own terms. And oftentimes when you do that, it's not a pretty picture. A few years ago at the University of Connecticut, actually more than a few years ago, I'm getting old, probably a decade ago, at the University of Connecticut, I had the opportunity to debate the former US ambassador to both Israel and Egypt, Daniel Kurtzer. And one of the things in this debate he said up at University of Connecticut, Stanford actually, was pretty apt. He said there's two schools of diplomacy. There's a school of diplomacy when it comes to engaging with rogue regimes. And by the way, when I say rogue regimes, it's sort of like that Potter Stewart quote about pornography. I can't define it, but I know it when I see it. Actually, the Clinton administration did a pretty good job. Tony Lake, the former national security advisor, did a pretty good job of actually defining rogue regime in terms of a state that doesn't abide by the normal rules of diplomacy, doesn't respect the normal rules of diplomacy, engages in terrorism, engages in nuclear proliferation, and isn't easily deterrable. He wrote an article, I think in 1994 in Foreign Affairs, outlining this because, of course, it was during the Clinton administration that the whole notion of rogue regime became much more a policy concern. I mean, just 3 years after the fall of the Soviet Union. Now, what Daniel Kurtzer said is when dealing with rogue regimes, you have two strategies. One is you wait until the stars align, and then you take advantage of that alignment. So, for example, when it comes to Middle East peace, the Middle East peace process, you had the fall of the Soviet Union remove the patron from many of the rejectionist states in the region. For example, Syria and Libya. Then you had, and for that matter, the PLO. Then you had Operation Desert Storm, the operation to liberate Kuwait, where we achieved in about 100 hours what the Islamic Republic of Iran had failed to achieve in 8 years with regard to Saddam Hussein. And that opened some doors. And so the Clinton administration engaged in, actually no, I'm sorry, it was the George H.W. Bush administration, launched the Madrid process, which was the first time that the Israelis sat down with so many of the other countries, which had technically been, and still are, in a state of war against the Jewish state. And the Saudis, the Syrians, the Palestinians, and this ultimately led to Oslo. Whatever one thinks of the Oslo process, it was enabled in many ways by the fall of the Soviet Union and by Operation Desert Storm. Now, that's one aspect. The other side of this is if the stars aren't aligning, then what you do is you engage in a process. And the process to try to sort of slowly nudge that door open to get the stars to align in the right way. And that's generally the philosophy of not only US diplomacy, but European diplomacy as well. Now, one of the problems we have is a falsehood, a false value calculation, which argues that diplomacy never has a cost. So by engaging in this sort of process, we really have nothing to lose. And we've heard any numbers of different officials say this. And we've heard Hillary Clinton say this, we've heard Barack Obama say this, we've heard Nick Burns say this, we've heard Brent Scowcroft say this, and so forth. It's a common philosophy among both Democrats and Republicans. Diplomacy has no cost. And oftentimes the argument goes, there's a very, very high cost to military action. And that's absolutely true. And that sanctions also have a cost. They have an economic cost back home, and also they're slow. They seldom work by themselves. But just because strategy A and strategy B have a high cost, does that mean that strategy C is cost-free? So when you're engaging in a process, in effect when you're rushing diplomacy as well, is that a cost-free strategy? Let's think about this in a couple different examples. When the US hostages were seized in Iran on November 4th, 1979, the Carter administration understandably wanted to free the hostages, and so they wanted to engage. They offered to engage with the Iranian foreign minister, Ibrahim Yazdi. And Ibrahim Yazdi says, yes, we'll talk with you, but these are our demands. Well, 2 weeks later, Ibrahim Yazdi was dismissed, and the new Iranian foreign minister was a guy named Sadat Khubzadeh. And he said, yes, I'll engage with you, But in order to prove his own credentials, he upped the demands. The more we rushed diplomacy, and he was overthrown in about 2 or 3 weeks and then subsequently executed. The more we rushed diplomacy, the more we actually created a situation where the bars to resolving that diplomacy were higher and higher. Likewise, rushing diplomacy. Does anyone, there's this false narrative out there, and certainly shown in movies like Argo, in where you have Ayatollah Khomeini overthrow the Islamic Republic of Iran, and then suddenly we've broken diplomatic relations and our hostages are taken. That's not the way it happened. And Khomeini returned to Iran on February 1st, 1979. The hostages were taken 9 months later, on November 4th, 1979, and we actually didn't break diplomatic relations with the Islamic Republic of Iran until April of 1980, because Carter wanted to keep diplomacy alive in the hope of resolving this through dialogue. Well, why is it that the hostages were taken on November 4th, 1979, more than 9 months after Khomeini returned to Iran? And people forget, we had diplomatic relations with Ayatollah Khomeini's Iran. And the answer was an event that happened November 1st in Algiers, Algeria, where Zbigniew Brzezinski, Carter's national security advisor, was at a multilateral meeting. He saw the Iranian prime minister, I guess Mehdi Bazargan, and he shook his hand. He wasn't authorized to shake his hand. He wasn't really authorized to talk about it, to talk to Bazargan and so forth, but he went ahead and shook his hand. It never hurts to talk. Well, someone took a photo of that, and it was published, it made its way into Iranian newspapers by November 3rd, and it outraged students who thought that Bazargan was going to betray the revolution to the Americans. And after all, what the American embassy had been doing was trying to basically come to a new working relation with the new regime inside Iran, and that led to the decision to take the hostages in order to become an impediment to any further rapprochement. Then, when you look at the interviews of the hostage takers and some of the memoirs which have been published in Persian, I talk about this in my book. There's a flyer there. If you go on Amazon and you find the book Dancing with the Devil and it's a vampire romance, that's the wrong book. But what happened is once Carter took military action off the table, this was leaked by a Carter administration official, Gary Sitt, to the New York Times. They said, the hostage takers said that when they read that, they understood that there was absolutely nothing to be lost by upping their demands and increasing what was a 48 to 72 hour sitting became something that lasted 444 days and pretty much condemned Carter to a one-term presidency. The fact of the matter is, rushing diplomacy can have a very, very high cost and can actually make things much more difficult, make problems much more difficult to resolve. I do need to be fair to Jimmy Carter, however. At the time, we had no idea what the Iranians were going to do. And there was a fear, a real fear, that the hostages would be put on trial and executed. So Carter, I mean, hindsight's always 20/20, but at the same time, we can learn our lessons by just looking back at some of these past episodes of high-profile diplomacy. Now, what else can we say with regard to diplomacy? One thing which should be very, very obvious, and this has certainly undercut both the Israel-Palestinian peace process, as well as other major peace processes, is that incentivizing defiance oftentimes undercuts diplomacy. When you reward bad behavior, the answer is it creates more bad behavior. So take the Reagan-era arms for hostages scheme with regard to Iran. Most people forget that the genesis of the Iran-Contra affair, which again paralyzed the second term of the Reagan presidency, was actually a desire for more diplomacy. It started at a National Security Council meeting when I believe it was Bud McFarlane basically asked the question, what leverage do we have to influence succession after Ayatollah Khomeini's death? Let's hope that Ayatollah Khomeini, in other words, is just an exception. A nightmare. But once he's over, we could get back to the business of dealing with this new regime. And the State Department, the CIA came back and said, we really don't have much leverage. So the idea became, well, let's give Iran what it needs, spare parts and arms, And that can help build some relationships which we can then leverage in order to develop relations and hopefully guide things to a positive outcome upon Ayatollah Khomeini's death. If any of you have questions about this, we're in, of course, Congress right now, and you just need to look at the old Tower Commission report, which looked into the Iran-Contra affair. Now, in this case, what a lot of people forget is put aside for a second the illegalities of the Nicaragua side of this. What you basically had was a situation where Iran did release many of the hostages which had been seized in Lebanon in exchange for the spare parts. But no sooner were those hostages released, then I think in 2 weeks Iranian-backed proxies, basically Hezbollah, seized 3 more American hostages. Again, history repeats. The Obama administration, we now know, not only ransomed, but ransomed in cash, $1.4 billion worth of cash. A number of Americans, or Iranian Americans, who were held in Iran, for some reason they left Bob Levinson, the former FBI agent, behind. But this was seen as a great success. This was cheered as the fact that because of our diplomacy with Iran, good things can happen. But now I think the count is 9 or 10 American or dual nationals who have been seized in the aftermath of that billion-dollar-plus deal and are now hostages in Iran. And what we've basically done is put a price tag on their head, which is at least $1 billion. And because the Iranians aren't going to move back on the price that was paid to them before. Again, with diplomacy having a cost, many of you remember the 2010 plot to kill the Saudi ambassador in Washington, D.C. That plot was discovered by analyzing a known Quds Force, this elite unit of the Revolutionary Guard Corps, a Quds Force bank account. Now, because we paid that money in cash now, with this most recent hostage deal, we no longer have the ability to monitor some of these bank accounts because it's a lot easier to move cash around anonymously than it is to electronically transfer money, which, again, another cost of diplomacy. Desperation leads to failure. And this is something which we really should be cognizant about. The world doesn't, I mean, we're in Congress right now, so we're at the heart of the navel, and Americans like, or Congress likes to navel gaze. It's always our fault. It's always something we've done. The world has to operate on our political calendar. But the fact of the matter is, it doesn't. And so when we try to rush incentives, for example, during the George W. Bush administration ahead of the Annapolis conference, or I'll pick on the George W. Bush administration for a second because I do want to be bipartisan in this, and certainly there's enough blame to go around. I think it's fair to say that many of the political officials around George W. Bush thought that Iraq and Afghanistan had undercut his legacy. And therefore, Condoleezza Rice especially wanted there to be a new legacy. I mean, a Hail Mary pass. I spent too much time in the Middle East. A Hail Mary pass, not a Hail Mahdi pass, in order to rescue this legacy. Hence the Annapolis conference. And we also had the same thing with regard to North Korea. There was this belief that we could take North Korea, that we could have a peace agreement with North Korea. This was one of the reasons why North Korea was removed from the state sponsor of terrorism list. Now, according to the Congressional Research Service, Hezbollah was on the state sponsor of terrorism list for a couple reasons. There was the bombings and so forth in Rangoon, Burma, now Myanmar, as well as a bombing of a South Korean plane which had taken off from Sharjah and killed 200 people or so. But they were still actively involved in terrorism with regard to the Tamil Tigers in Sri Lanka and with regard to Hezbollah. All those tunnels in which Hezbollah has operated and hid their missiles, especially in the 2006 Israel-Hezbollah war, those were built by North Koreans. And this is in the Congressional Research Service, but we basically we laundered North Korea for the sake of having the shot of diplomacy at tremendous cost. And we can see that cost in the headlines today, and we can see this cost in the tunnel network in southern Lebanon today. That has continued. When you remove a country from the state-sponsored terrorism list, you remove it from some of the automated sanctions, which make it harder for people to do business with that country. Desperation also matters. We see this with the agreed framework with North Korea. We see this with regard to the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. And we basically forfeited our leverage in order to get a deal done by the Obama administration's political calendar. It became about political leverage rather than anything to do with American national security. At the very least, let me just give you an example. And Iran got, I'll use very conservative figures, $50 billion in sanctions relief and unfrozen assets. Keep in mind the annual budget of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps is officially about $5 billion. So this is a decade's worth of their budget flowing back specifically to the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. Keep in mind, it only costs about $2,000 to stage a suicide attack as well. So let's just put this in perspective. Now, we gave them that money up front and then demand compliance. It was all part of getting them to deal. We withdrew many of the restrictions on ballistic missile development in order to get the Iranians to sign off. We could have done the leverage the other way and used the American political calendar to our advantage by saying, you're never going to get a better deal than us. You know that whoever comes next, whether it's Secretary Clinton or whether it's Donald Trump, is going to take a much harder line on you. So you've got to give us this concession rather than us constantly having to give you this concession. But Secretary Kerry didn't do that. And as an end result, situation, giving this money up front instead of calibrated to compliance is like giving a 4-year-old dessert first and then demanding she eat her Brussels sprouts. Saying this from personal experience. Metrics matter in terms of diplomacy. And the State Department doesn't use metrics. So for example, when we start a high-profile diplomatic engagement with regard, for example, to Israel-Palestinian conflict, a good metric might be the number of terrorist attacks which are committed. I find it very troubling that more Israelis died in terror in the 3 months after Oslo was signed than in the 3 months before Oslo was signed. Likewise, we can look at this the other way when we look at the separation fence, which, by the way, has precedent in Morocco and Northern Ireland, between Pakistan and India, between Saudi Arabia and Yemen. The UN built one on disputed land in Cyprus. So let's put aside the castigation of Israel for a second. A good metric would be, has it been effective at stopping terrorism? And as someone who did I did a postdoc at Hebrew University in 2001, 2002, so I was there at the height of the terror campaign. The answer is yeah. Terrorism has declined 95+% because of that border fence. We don't have any sort of metric like that to judge our policy. I made some poor intern go back through all the declassified documents and compare it to every single State Department press conference with regard to the Taliban, with regard to Iraq, with regard to the PLO, and so forth. When we were talking publicly about progress, seeing what actually was the case, and in every single instance, what the State Department spokesman or White House spokesman was saying across administrations had no bearing into reality as to what was actually going on according to the classified material. Liberty also matters. You know, when people say diplomacy doesn't have a cost, not everyone has to prioritize human rights. But we do need to recognize that there is a proportional increase in the numbers of public executions inside Iran whenever there is a reformist in power, as opposed to a hardliner. Maybe that's because the hardliners want to show, or the reformists want to show, that this reformism is for external consumption only. Maybe it's because the reformists are sincere, but the hardliners want to show these guys don't really have the full power. But either way, that should raise our concerns. And one of the best metrics about whether a rogue regime is actually reformed is religious freedom. And I would just point out that there's only one country in the Middle East in which Christians are a growing population, and that's Israel. I'll just conclude here by saying some people, and again I say this from Quaker school background, have this Pollyannish notion with regard to track 2 dialogue, this idea of people-to-people exchanges. And unfortunately, it seldom works. It's not a panacea. For example, some people say sporting diplomacy. It's a great thing. And you send American wrestlers or American soccer players to Iran, and this will break down barriers between the American people and the Iranian people. Well, last I checked, there weren't really barriers between the American people and the Iranian people. And there never has been. The problem has been with their government, and sending a wrestling team over doesn't affect the Iranian nuclear program. Likewise, what about Jesse Owen? I mean, for any of you who saw the movie Race, Jesse Owen in the Nazi Olympics in 1936. I mean, the idea was Jesse Owen went over, he won 4 gold medals, and he delegitimized Nazi ideology in the heartland in Berlin. Yeah, but the Holocaust still happened. And Hitler's racial theories were still amplified. And therefore, can we really say that this sort of track 2 dialogue is a success? I'm not saying don't do it, but I'm saying we've got to stop this Pollyannish notion. As an academic, I reserve the right to conclude 4 or 5 times. So in conclusion this time, and this time I mean it, I don't want to be all negative and say that diplomacy is always bad. I'm just saying you need to go into it with eyes wide open, that it has a cost, and sometimes the cost is worth it. Where have we gone wrong? Over the last 25 years or so, we've started sequencing our strategies. Military strategists will often, in military academies, will be taught that diplomacy has a diplomatic and informational and military, a good strategy has a diplomatic and informational and military and economic component to it. And in the old days, we would do this comprehensively. Now we sequence, so we try diplomacy first. If that doesn't work, then we might try economic sanctions. If that doesn't work, then military is the last resort. But let's put aside the fact that military doesn't just mean bombing. Containment and deterrence are both military strategies, and if you're not willing to put the investment in the military, then you become a paper tiger. Generally speaking, though, the whole is greater than the sum of the parts, and this really came to fruition, was shown with regard to Libya in 2003, and that whole process was, it started under the Clinton administration, it concluded under the Bush administration, but it really showed that when you're willing to use leverage, that matters. When Secretary Clinton says, even Ronald Reagan sat down to talk with Mikhail Gorbachev to negotiate the end of the Cold War, it's important to remember, and this is something that Clinton omitted, that happened after a 5-year military buildup which was domestically unpopular to make it happen. Peace isn't made between equals. Peace is made when one side is stronger and frankly can dictate the terms. And so with this, let me conclude and put open the floor to questions.
Around you.
No, because first of all, if anything, what informed my career was spending time with the Taliban, spending time in Iran, and learning what it meant to live under an autocratic regime. I also had many problems, and this is something that the American Friends Service Committee, which is the NGO of the Quakers, oftentimes ignores, about how the American Friends Service Committee came to the defense of, and for a short period of time became a shill for the Khmer Rouge in denying the violence that was being perpetrated. But I think while nonviolence has a role, where I think the American Friends Service Committee specifically has gone wrong, because the Quaker community, of course, is much more diverse than just the AFSC, is in confusing politics with pacifism and being very selective in how they approach it. Another way to look at this is that when we look at terrorism today, and again, terrorism is one of those terms that there is no international consensus or legal definition of. There's no single definition of terrorism. We have more than 250 different definitions of terrorism in play. Some people look at what motivates terrorism as rooted in grievance. On the other side of the spectrum is ideology. I'm not saying it's either or, but it's all well and good to talk about nonviolent solutions if terrorism is solely motivated by grievance, because then you can address the grievance and the terrorism goes away. But if it's rooted in ideology, then it's a much deeper problem, because you can't always negotiate that away. And in terms of the Israel-Arab conflict, I would point out that in 1946, the Intelligence Division of the Department of War, which was the predecessor to the Defense Intelligence Agency, was charged with an over-the-horizon assessment of what the greatest threats to American national security would be now that Nazism, fascism, and the Japanese army had been defeated. And they concluded that there were two over-the-horizon threats to national security. One was communism, and the second was Islamist terrorism. Now, the reason I bring this up is this is a year before the partition of Palestine, 2 years before the creation of the State of Israel. So what they were looking at wasn't the grievance that's alleged to have been created by Israel's existence, but rather by what the Muslim Brotherhood was perpetrating in Egypt with a campaign of, frankly, assassination to rid Egyptian society of any influence of Western liberal thought. And in a situation like that, I don't want to resort to violence as a first resort, but I'm not sure whether I fully agree with the Quaker approach. Honestly, the reason I went to a Quaker school was growing up within Philly city limits. In the 70s and 80s, the school system was always on strike, and the Quaker schools were pretty excellent schools. I'm going to punt the question a little bit because my academic specialty is much more Iran than mandatory Palestine. What I do want to point out, and what I talk about a little bit in my book, is as one of the key US mistakes. Is that with regard, I see Palestinian nationalism, and I think it's a pretty safe statement. Palestinian nationalism grew in reaction to and in parallel to Zionism. Now, the first Intifada in 1987 was pretty indigenous. Many of the Palestinians, and grassroots, many of the Palestinians who were participating in the first Intifada, they understood Israel. They understood Israelis. For those that had been in Israeli prisons, they spoke Hebrew. They could access the Israeli press and so forth. What happened was this belief that the State Department has, and the Bush administration at the time had, that it's always easier to negotiate with dictators. It's easier to negotiate with dictators and that somehow the dictatorship could bring the public at large on board with any compromises that they needed. And that's why they brought back the PLO leadership from Tunis, where they had been in disgrace after having been exiled in 1983 following the Israeli invasion of Lebanon. Now, by doing that, it assumed again that Yasser Arafat was sincere. In reality, we need to remember that if you are rewarded by participating in a process, then you don't actually need to go for the peace. And Anwar Sadat went for the peace, and look what happened to him. But if you can be the most hosted person in the White House, if you can receive billions of dollars worth of aid, then you don't need to make that deal. When it comes to delivering the people, incitement matters. And the fact of the matter is, what Arafat was doing, because he had no desire to make peace, he walked away in 2000, was he basically said, hey, look, I'll say one thing to the Americans, but I'm not going to prepare my people to make any sort of compromise. And then when diplomats demand a compromise, I'm going to throw up my hands and say I can't because my people won't allow it. And that's the cycle we got ourselves in. There's this notion that we need to be an even broker. And that's one of the most caustic notions out there. Because whenever one engages in that sort of moral equivalence, it actually encourages greater radicalization. Because if you're going to be an even broker, if you're always going to come down in the middle, then what's to stop one side from taking a more extreme position to try to shift the eventual compromise over? And when we look at the history of the Israeli-Palestinian peace negotiations, I think that pattern truly explains it. I'm sorry I can't answer your question. I mean, someone like Dory Gold or Michael Rubin or Michael Rubin would be much better at that. Okay, what I would answer this in a few ways is, I mean, forcing concessions doesn't bring peace. The most effective peace is usually made by two sides that on their own decide they want to make peace. And I can't think of a single effective UN, for example, peacekeeping force. The most effective peacekeeping force I can think of was the multinational force of observers in the Sinai Peninsula, which was put in place after Egypt tried war and then decided they wanted peace. Israel wanted peace, and therefore both sides were ready for peace instead of having this imposed on them. If I could, and generally speaking, I think the United States shouldn't, I mean, the President of the United States should be the leader of the free world rather than the zoning commissioner for Jerusalem. I mean, there's a negative to getting so involved in some of these issues. If I had my druthers, these are the two things I would ask. Number one, Israel made a comprehensive peace offer, both in the year 2000 and the year 2008, which it wasn't coming out of the blue. It had been negotiated with their Palestinian interlocutors. And in both cases, first Yasser Arafat and then Mahmoud Abbas, who I think is in the 13th year of his 4-year term, walked away without a counteroffer. Going back to what I said before about the problem of working with dictators rather than going directly to the people, frankly, I would put up the 2008 peace deal to a referendum. Let the Israelis vote on it, let the Palestinians vote on it. If the Palestinians say no, then let's move on to something else. I mean, we can't force peace on a population that doesn't want peace. And I do think we need to eliminate the United Nations Refugee Works Administration, or whatever UNRWA stands for. Originally, it was supposed to disappear, I think, in 1952, and it's a prime example of moral hazard. And the fact of the matter is, and again, I'm citing Bernard Lewis on this, if you took the definition of refugee that UNRWA uses, and you apply it to the world at large, between India and Pakistan today, there would be more than 200 million refugees. And we've got to move on. I mean, there's lots of other deserving people, whether it's the Rohingya Muslims in Burma, whether it's some of the Syrian refugees or others. The other thing which I think the Arabs need to do much better is reach out directly to the Israeli public. When I did my postdoc at Hebrew University, one of the things that disappointed me about the Israeli assessment of the region is that Israelis wanted to see the entire region through the lens of the Palestinians, or perhaps at the time Lebanon. That was what their experience was. But as someone who's traveled across the region from Pakistan and Afghanistan and Iran to Sudan to Morocco and so forth, I can tell you, I mean, the world isn't like the Palestinians, the world isn't like the Lebanese, and so it behooves the Bahrainis, the Kuwaitis, the Saudis to actually talk to Israeli journalists and broadcast what they're thinking directly to the Israeli population. At the same time, the Israelis need to wake up and recognize that the world at large isn't simply the Palestinians. But that said, I think some of the Israelis have recognized this. The people that didn't the most were the previous US administration. Because when I, just back in the napkin calculation, the Israelis, of course, have diplomatic relations with Jordan and Egypt. Relations with Egypt have never been warmer. On top of which, the Israelis have great relations now, even if informal, with the Moroccans, with the Tunisians, with the Saudis, with the Kuwaitis, with the Qataris even, with the Bahrainis, with the Emiratis, with the Omanis. And so who's really isolated here? I mean, compare this to Recep Tayyip Erdogan in Turkey. Let's think of the list of capitals that Recep Tayyip Erdogan isn't welcome in. Cairo, Tripoli, Jerusalem, Ramallah, because he supports Hamas rather than the Palestinian Authority, Riyadh, Damascus. I mean, for someone who wanted zero problems with his neighbors, he's certainly done a good job of screwing it up. So I do think we need to look at the situation holistically. And again, I don't think we need to be, I don't think the Israelis or the United States should be desperate for peace. And if the Palestinians want it, it should come. I think the best thing we could do is A, put it to a referendum, and B, cut off aid to the Palestinians so that, and by the way, I'm fine with cutting off aid, most aid to Israel as well. But this way, the government can be accountable. And if you know you're going to get your schools built, if you know you're going to get your health clinics built, then there's no reason, since money is fungible, not to invest in rockets. And that's where I think the world's gone wrong. Sorry. No, in that case, no. I think there's a desperation for the Americans to be a strong horse, once again, and to put meaning in the reality of a relationship. But I think it would be much more likely that many of the Arab countries would turn to something like Russia as a second choice, rather than turn to Iran. I mean, first of all, I think we need to put, just to be blunt, I was one of the people that signed the Never Trump letter. I don't regret signing it, just so you know where I'm coming from. That said, I think there's general consensus that Jared Kushner is one of the few people in the Trump administration who truly has been punching above his weight, that has proven himself to be very able and very apt in a White House where so many people are still trying to find their sea legs. And in this case, another way to look at it is, what does it take to be a professional diplomat? You know, I mean, I'm not saying this out of bitterness or anything. I passed the Foreign Service test. I passed the written, I passed the oral. I was offered a political position, a political cone, which is, at the time, one of the most desirable. And that was scary to me, coming right out of grad school without any real life experience, that I could suddenly become a diplomat. And then you get sucked into a culture in which, I'm sorry, it doesn't allow for outside the box thinking. And at the same time, it embraces tenaciously this conventional wisdom without ever looking at a lessons learned approach. And I think when we look at that, we can name Middle East peace coordinators over the years, people of both parties, people who have had their start as professional diplomats. I mean, you have perhaps Kant, you have Dennis Ross, you have Bill Burns, and so forth. And I'm not sure that their record shows that they would be in the black rather than the red. No, I mean, across the political spectrum, people, even people who voted to not disapprove of the Iran deal, criticized it. So it was criticized both by Democrats and Republicans. And the Iran deal separately set back the cause of counter-proliferation decades, because you look at the precedent of the South Africa case in 1991 or the Libya case in 2003, and what was demanded from Iran was significantly less. Heck, Iran didn't even ratify the additional protocol of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which means at best it's the 144th most rigorous inspection regime. But you were asking about Israel. This answer is not going to satisfy you. What Israel wants is recognition and normalcy. It wants to be able to have trade, I mean, outlets for its businesses and so forth. Now, where I think this logic goes wrong, and on this you and I may agree, is that there's an assumption out there, a projection put forward by many Americans, and frankly some Israelis as well, that people don't want to do what's not in their interest. But when we look at the history of Arab-Israeli conflict, and the choices which so many Arab leaders have made, leading to boycotts, leading to the complete, I mean, the corrosion of their societies. I mean, when we look at what's happened in Syria, when we look at what's happened in Lebanon, it's a false assumption to say that elected leaders, kings, or appointed leaders are always going to do what's in the best economic interest of their citizenry. We think that because that's why, whether we're Democrats or Republicans, that's why we elect people. But that's not the case when ideology trumps over grievance. Second question is yes, I think they should be designated terrorist organizations if it quacks like a duck. I don't think the power doesn't lie with the president, the power lies with the supreme leader. I think a much more serious question we need to ask is what's going to happen when Khamenei dies, because the time is coming. And he's allowed himself to be photographed getting treatment for prostate cancer and so forth, which was his way of preparing the public for the inevitable. The other thing I worry about with the Iranian presidency is generally I see it as a master marionette where you, I mean, for example, Ahmadinejad really empowered Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and Revolutionary Guard Corps veterans to the point where more than half of his cabinet was actually staffed by IRGC, and there was only one cleric in the cabinet, the Minister of Intelligence, who, by the way, had been the chaplain to the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. When Rouhani came in, he fired a lot of the IRGC guys because they were becoming a power center unto themselves. But did he replace them with liberals? No, he replaced them with veterans of the intelligence ministry. So what we have now isn't a reform cabinet, we have in effect a KGB cabinet. Now I would expect, I mean I'm a historian so I get paid to predict the past, and admittedly I only get that right about half the time. But I would expect Rouhani would get a second term. But then what worries me is what comes next as the pendulum swings back. And here I highlight how Qasem Soleimani, the head of the Quds Force, is increasingly in the limelight. And when you are the head of a shadowing network which conducts what we consider terrorism, most all of these heads like to stay out of public notice. But just the other day, and like 2 days ago or 3 days ago in the Iranian press, he's not just talking about Iranian force projection. He's talking about how to organize the Iranian economy. And to me, that suggests that he's preparing for a presidential run, not in 2017, but in 2021, and that worries me. Thank you guys very much. Thanks, Stan.